Thank you, Base. Thanks, everybody. I know it's a super early Sunday morning, so appreciate very much that you decided to show up and hear me speak. It means a lot. So I'll go ahead and get started. And I'll try very hard to be as energetic as you can tolerate this early in the morning. But please do let me know if you need to hear a little bit more volume or anything like that. So let's go ahead and get started. My talk today is about modifying application security frameworks. And I wanted to use a Minecraft theme since I work in games. So bear with me. I have lots of themes here, memes, and all kinds of mid-journey images that I created just for you today. All right, let's go over the agenda a little bit. So I'll introduce myself very briefly, talk about my background, and then we'll talk a little bit about why AppSec guidance as a generic framework doesn't really work very well for individual industries. And those of you who have moved around industries like myself will quickly realize this is something that you've experienced as well. And we'll talk a little bit about how every business unit kind of needs something slightly different, and we have to learn to adapt to that, to those needs of the business. And then I'll talk about how to tailor your own AppSec program and what to think about first when you want to start building out a framework. Okay, so a little bit about me. I am the Senior Application Security Engineer for Netflix Games. Prior to that, I was the head of AppSec at Pendo. I think some of my former pals are here today, so I'm happy to see them. And more previously to that, I was an engineering leader in a bunch of different regulated environments. And happy to talk about that, but it's pretty boring to hear over a talk, so pull me in the corner if you'd like to chat more. Let's talk a little bit about generic security guidance. See if any of these recommendations sound familiar to you. Just use input validation. Don't use SMS MFA. Just follow the principle of least privilege. And you want to reach full security maturity, whatever the heck that means. There are exceptions to each of these well-regarded recommendations, and so I'm going to give you a few examples. Let's say, for example, that you're receiving a lot of unformatted customer data. Validating inputs for every single field is virtually impossible. It's going to be really messy and very, very inaccurate. There's a really good likelihood that some very clever customer will break your input validation formats. They will find your edge cases no matter what, I assure you. They will find them. And then you're going to spend a lot of time trying to reduce the edge cases that you continuously receive from those customers. And at that point, you're really spending a lot of time just trying to validate those inputs as opposed to having a broad security posture. However, if you consider output encoding instead, it's possible for you to receive inputs of any format, or most formats, we should say, and then be able to distribute that data in a way that you can control in a much more consistent way. You can determine how it should be displayed, what format your downstream data processors can receive that information in a much more consistent and clear way. A second example is the prevailing recommendation to not use SMS MFA. And while, of course, that is a great recommendation for most users, there are still plenty of users who don't have access to smartphones. So if you do enforce this, they won't be able to download things like Duo or Authy, and then you prevent them from being able to have access to multi-factor authentication at all. So it's really important that you think about the end users, and although SMS MFA is not perfect, it's better than nothing. Let's talk a little bit about the principle of least privilege. An excellent method to live by, in theory, most of the time, but if we ignore the availability piece of the CIA triad, and you're putting down rules and regulations around who can access what, but you prevent your users from being able to access the things that they actually need, you're kind of destroying the purpose of the principle of least privileged anyway. So you have to think about those types of things and what the end goal really is for your software platform. And finally, let's talk about the concept of full security maturity. Again, I don't think that's a real thing, but we'll talk about it a little bit. While there's maturity frameworks like OpenSAN that you can utilize, the truth is that it is just a point in time, an example of where you have gone from beginning to end, but there's really no end. Your business is going to continue to change and modify, and you'll have to adapt your security controls to adjust for that. In a lot of cases, the security best practices I mentioned fit the needs of a software product, but as we all know, one size definitely doesn't fit all. There are exceptions to every single rule, and we have to be adaptable and be willing to accept that and adapt to the business as needed. We also need to think about whether our risk reduction recommendations are something that our partner engineers can actually implement in practice. And we have to think about the industry that we're operating in as well. There are risk controls that make sense for very highly regulated industries that would completely halt a business, like a streaming service, for example. So let's zoom out a little bit and talk about a couple of industries and what those security best practices might be and what those needs are. One thing that all industries have in common is that there is some data, business data or PII or content data that you want to keep safe from intruders and keep from internal users and employees from accessing that's highly sensitive, and you get to determine what that means. What needs to be secured, however, and the risk tolerance that you have is dependent on the industry. In the next section, we'll discuss 3 different industries and how to think through securing applications without hindering the business from continuing to move forward. Let's talk about my favorite, which is healthcare. It is one of the more regulated industries for those of you who have worked in it. As you already know, healthcare and clinical research has very strong regulations, and you must abide by them to be able to continue to operate and capture patient data in any shape or form. As a result of legal compliance requirements such as HIPAA, CLIA, good clinical practices, and many others, the way in which patient data is handled and processed and distributed is very determined by the regulatory bodies that I just mentioned before. You don't actually get to decide how you handle and process data. You could get sued out of business. You could get sued by your patients. There's a huge slew of really bad things that could happen if you choose to go your own way. So as the healthcare industry has illustrated, it's more important to protect that patient data than to think about implementing cutting-edge technology. You have to ensure that your data is not accessible to the wrong users or to the wrong services. Ultimately, the data integrity is crucial, and ensuring that you know where it's going and where it's come from. So if you think about things like the UDP protocol, if you're trying to then distribute that data someplace else, but you're trying to capture data, for example, from a sensitive medical instrument, you can't run the risk of having packets that are dropped or missing data. So having the right protocols in place are super important. Additionally, you have to think about how you encrypt that data. You wouldn't want to only encrypt at rest or only encrypt in transit. You really are very, very responsible for what happens to that data. If you compare that to some sort of entertainment industry, for example, where, of course, we don't want content leaks, that's kind of our bread and butter, UDP is actually crucially important to get streaming services up and running. So something to think about as a comparison. Let's talk a little bit about software platforms. That's probably where most of us have chosen to operate, but we will certainly interact with software platforms regardless if that's the industry we're in today. They can be really complex, as I'm sure you're well aware, as complex as engineers can make them. Each platform will have very specific needs and requirements depending on the structure of that platform. And so I'm going to go over a couple of high-level things to consider when your product is a software platform. while not always true for a lot of software as a service or platform as a service companies, the service you're providing is one which requires your tooling to be implemented and integrated into your customer's infrastructure. So let's use Stripe as an example. It's a payments endpoint that is then injected into the customer's web application so that they can receive payments. You can also use an example like Terraform, which is infrastructure that you actually put into your customer's code base. So if you think about these types of tools, what's something you might want to consider putting in place as security architecture? First, you need to think long and hard about monitoring and detecting any sort of anomalous behavior that might come from your customers, in particular because they're going to be interacting with your software infrastructure, and you have to consider the fact that they may not have the same security posture as you do. So you want to protect yourself from your customers as much as you want to protect yourself from the hackers out there who are trying to get into your software. There's plenty of examples of this. SolarWinds is one that comes to mind. You can actually hurt other customers as well if you don't have a positive security posture and a way to detect and monitor anomalous behavior that you want to be able to stop. Let's talk a little bit about entertainment. Here we're talking about games, movies, books, the whole gamut. When you consider security for entertainment, the primary asset you want to protect is the content itself. That means ensuring that the movies, the television, the games that you enjoy today don't get leaked too early. It also means that once you do release it, that people who have potentially paid for that don't have access to it. There's a lot of tools that I'm sure you're familiar with from the entertainment industry that rely on things such as DRM and watermarking, strict access control, even internally. But none of those are perfect. You see headlines all the time of content leaks for platforms like Netflix. Once it's leaked, though, you can't unleak it. So you have to be really careful about making sure things don't get out when they're not ready to be released. You only get that one chance to release the content the right way, in the right markets, and at the right time, and to the right people. So I made up this company called Zigzag. It is not Stripe, but it is just like Stripe, to talk about this case study. It is also a payments API, but just not Stripe. This payments API has a few core requirements. The payment processor needs high availability. If it goes down, then your customers aren't getting paid. You also need high integrity. So you want to make sure that the payments you're receiving are real, that they're coming from a real customer, that you can trace them if you need to. And so as a result of that, we have to make sure that we're sending the right money to the right places, that we're receiving the right money from the right places, and that the money isn't fraudulent. You also have to follow compliance requirements like PCI DSS, which dictate how you handle employee passwords and many other things, like segmenting out your network from the business logic of handling payment card infrastructure. And as with all things involving money, there are times when you need to be able to stop payments from going through. For example, if sanctions have been imposed on a specific country, you may be required to avoid doing business with that country, and you have to be able to prove that you're blocking traffic from that country and from individuals that are associated with that country. You also need to ensure that you can prove what payments went to whom with granular detail in case there is a fraudulent case that you need to investigate. You'll have to comply with law enforcement if such a thing happens. So you have to have really good records. All right, let's talk a little bit about games, a little more exciting than payment card industry types of things. In this case, I created a game that is a fictional game called Kawaii Cupcakes, which is why you see Kawaii Cupcakes up here. It's hosted on a platform just like Steam, but is not Steam. We obviously want to launch our game with lots of fanfare, which means it cannot get out before we're ready. What should we be thinking about then? We want highly granular internal access controls. Content leaks can occur both internally and externally, bear in mind, and internal leaks are a very big problem in this industry. So we have to ensure we have tight control over internal employees' ability to access information about unreleased content and ensure that we're keeping track of who can access what. There are strong debates on whether completely preventing game mods, for example, is a surefire way to incite the ire of game fans. But finding the right balance is critical to the future success of your platform. You have to consider what those mods are actually doing and whether it's degrading the integrity of the game itself, the gameplay itself, or if it's putting your other customers in harm's way. If you allow game mods and you host them on your platform, make sure that your users are aware this is a thing that they could be downloading in case they need to be ensured that there could be additional risk to that. And that includes the risk to their personal safety, which is something we think a lot about when we talk about children and Roblox. Those types of things are something you have to consider. There's also a way for you to sandbox those mods if you so choose, to prevent real damage to the underlying gameplay or to other users. And finally, let's talk a little bit about two topics that are security adjacent, but still important to security postures as a whole. And that's preventing abuse and chat in games. While that usually falls in the domain of customer trust or customer safety, it is our job as security professionals to help your CS colleagues by having very easily auditable logs and the ability to ban different users and be able to track and trace their behavior across the platform. Additionally, chat is super important to a lot of gameplay, but it's also rife with abuse. So you have to consider how your users are treating each other. You have to consider how they are able to modify the chat box, for example, because you might be opening yourself up to injection attack or opening up your customers and your users to injection attack as well. And finally, something that is called the hug of death. Your customers can become your own threat actors. If your game doesn't live up to their expectations, they may become an unwelcome threat against your own infrastructure. So now what? How do we decide, based on our industry knowledge, what to tackle first? Regardless of industry, you have to think about the data that you collect and that you want to protect. It could be a gameplay, it could be a movie, it could be physical intellectual property like a patent, it could be patient data, it could be employee PII. All of these things are things that you must consider protecting and how you would go about protecting it as best you can. So first you need to know where your data actually is, where it's going, who has access to it, who doesn't have access to it, who should have access to it, and who should not have access to it. Visibility is key to taking the first step in maturing your application security posture. If you don't know what you don't have, you can't protect it. You also need to know how that data moves from one system to the next. Very often, your security posture at the beginning of your software lifecycle fits for the needs of that particular software platform. But as the platform matures, you may have to change your security posture. You may be ingesting data you didn't need before. You may be ingesting data that you needed and now you don't. And so you have to constantly modify and ensure that you're right-sizing the data that you're collecting and how you're protecting it depending on where you are in the software development lifecycle as well. Once you have visibility into the data you're collecting and where it lives, and who and what has access to it, it's time to consider what security controls you like to put in place to make sure you are still consistently giving access to the right people at the right time. This is an ongoing process. It never ends. So we now move from knowing where our data is going to monitoring it. And the third step is to start iterating on this monitoring process. Now you're able to make right-sized security controls and ideally automated security controls to ensure that you no longer have to consistently modify this in a manual fashion. And then you can start to determine whether or not you have applications that are mission critical to the business, and maybe you have security controls that are much tighter compared to business data that's not as crucial to the business, and making sure that that continues to operate. And then consider what visibility you already have. Are you able to take quick action on anomalous web traffic or not? Do you know whether or not something should be shut down, that you have an abusive user, that this data or information is being accessed incorrectly? All of these things are things that you should really consider continuing to modify over time. So let's recap a little bit. As I mentioned before, each industry has different needs, but ultimately all we're trying to do is protect our business data and keep our users safe. So we want to protect the data that we know is mission critical to our business. We also want to protect our users, not only from hackers that are external, but from each other in some cases. And we want to make sure we are all in agreement on what it is that we need to protect. Obviously, mission critical data is super important. If you have content that is the crux of your business, you want to protect that as well. But there's also an integrity piece to this. You don't want to be known as the business that continues to get hacked, even if it is data that's maybe not mission critical. So think about the business integrity that you also need to protect. Another thing that's really important is you can put security controls in place, but if you don't know if they work or not, they're not very useful. So it's something to consider is to consistently and continuously audit the security controls that you have put in place to make sure that they're still right-sized, that they're still working, and that they're catching the things that you expect them to catch. Unknown unknowns are something we constantly fight, but it's something we have to continuously reevaluate over long periods of time. And so you want to continue to iterate. This is a role that never ends. We're constantly learning and growing. Our users are constantly challenging us on how they get into systems they shouldn't get into, even if it's unintentional. And at the end of the day, all we're really trying to do is protect the business and protect our users and protect one another. Thank you.